1:12 p.m. Claude responded. The war lasted 11 months. The war lasted 11 months. The Draken hegemony started it the way they started everything, with absolute certainty that it would end the way they decided it would end. They had started 14 wars in 3 centuries. They had won all 14. The pattern was established, and the pattern was reliable, and the pattern had produced, over 300 years of consistent application, a civilization whose entire understanding of itself was built on the premise that the pattern would continue. Sovereign Kaeldros signed the declaration himself. It was not a long document. The Draken had no tradition of elaborate diplomatic language, which they considered a form of weakness, the verbal equivalent of hesitation, words multiplying because the sender was not certain the central message was sufficient on its own. Kaeldros's declaration was 4 paragraphs. The first established the hegemony's claim to the 3 contested systems. The second gave the interstellar human compact 30 days to withdraw its colonial presence from those systems. The third described, briefly and without embellishment, what would happen if the withdrawal did not occur. The fourth was a single sentence. The sovereign expects the compact's compliance and considers this matter concluded. He signed it and transmitted it and went to his other business, because he had other business, and the matter was, as the document stated, concluded. He had never signed a surrender. 11 months later, a human officer named Colonel Sarah Akafer walked him through the ruins of Draken Prime's capital city, and Sovereign Kaeldros saw, for the first time in his life, the specific place where his decisions arrived. This is the account of what happened between the signing and the walking. The Draken hegemony was 312 years old, which was not ancient by galactic standards, but was old enough to have developed the particular quality of civilizations that had been powerful for a long time without serious interruption, which was the quality of not being able to fully imagine that the interruption was possible. Their history was a clean line: formation, expansion, consolidation, further expansion. And the cleanness of it had produced a culture in which certain questions were simply not asked, not because the culture was incurious, but because the answers had always been the same, and there was no mechanism for imagining that the answers could be different. They were not a cruel civilization. This was important to understand. Kaeldros was not a cruel being. His generals were not cruel. The Draken military across 14 wars had behaved with what it considered appropriate restraint. They did not exterminate, they did not torture, they did not pursue unnecessary destruction. They fought to win, and they won, and they established terms, and they moved on. By the standards of their own history and the history they knew of other species, they were a professional military power operating within normal parameters. What they were specifically was inexperienced with losing. This was not the same as being bad at war. They were excellent at war. Their ships were well built. Their commanders were skilled. Their doctrine was sophisticated within the parameters of the opponents it had faced. But doctrine built on 14 consecutive victories against opponents who had eventually broken under pressure was doctrine that had never been tested against an opponent that didn't break. And the gap between those two things was not visible until you were inside it. Supreme General Vethkon had commanded 8 of the 14 wars. He was the most decorated military officer in Draken history, a being who had spent 60 years refining the practice of overwhelming force applied with precision and speed. He understood war the way a master craftsman understood his craft, completely, at a level that had become instinct, the level where conscious thought was no longer the primary mechanism of expertise. He did not understand, when the declaration was signed and the fleet assembled, that he was about to encounter a material his craft had never worked with. The fleet that assembled in the staging area beyond Draken Prime's outer system was 90 warships. This was, by Vethkon's assessment, more than necessary. The human military, per intelligence files compiled over 3 years of observation, numbered approximately 50 to 70 vessels of mixed capability, and the Draken ships were individually superior in armament and armor. 90 ships was a statement more than a requirement. The statement was, "We are serious, and we know we are serious, and we want you to understand both things before we begin." Dross reviewed the fleet manifest on the morning of the deployment and found it satisfactory. He had been sovereign for 22 years, and he had a specific quality that his predecessors had lacked, which was patience, not strategic patience, which all Draken leaders cultivated, but personal patience, the capacity to let things develop without imposing urgency on them. He expected the colonial withdrawal to occur within the 30-day window. If it did not, he expected the demonstration phase to be brief. He expected the war, if it happened at all, to be over in 3 months. He went back to his other business. He had a great deal of other business. He was the sovereign of a civilization that administered 47 systems across a significant volume of space, and the day-to-day work of that administration was considerable. The declaration was a significant event in the way that all military actions were significant, but it was not the only significant event in his calendar, and he managed it with the efficient attention he brought to everything, which was complete within the time allocated and then set aside. On the 31st day, the compact's response arrived. It was a single sentence. "We will defend our space." Dross read it twice. He showed it to Vethcon, who read it once and made a sound that was not quite dismissive, and was not quite respectful, and was somewhere between the two. The sound of a professional encountering a decision by an opponent that he found tactically suboptimal but could not entirely dismiss. "They intend to fight," Vethcon said. "Yes," Dross agreed. The assessment was that they might. Their military culture suggests a preference for resistance. Vethcon set the document down. "It will be brief." Dross looked at the single sentence on his screen. "We will defend our space." He thought about the phrasing, not "we will fight," not "we reject your terms," but the specific territorial language of a species describing what it intended to do rather than what it intended not to do. He noted this as a stylistic observation and did not draw further conclusions from it, because he had no framework that would have allowed him to draw the conclusions it warranted. "How brief?" he asked. 3 months, Vethcon said, "possibly 2. The fleet deployed the following morning. Lieutenant Commander James Reyes had been in military intelligence for 9 years, which was long enough to have developed a specific relationship with information, which was that information told you what was true and not what it meant, and that the gap between those two things was where everything important lived. He was 29 years old, and he had been part of the Compact's Draken assessment team for the past 3 years, which meant he had spent 3 years reading everything the intelligence services could compile about the hegemony, their military doctrine, their political structure, their history, their culture, their 14 wars and 14 victories, and thinking about what it meant. He was in the assessment center when the declaration arrived, and he read it with the specific attention he brought to primary documents, which was complete and slow, attending to every word rather than the overall impression. He noted the final sentence. "The sovereign expects the compact's compliance and considers this matter concluded." He noted that the document had no escalation language, no mention of what happened after the demonstration phase, no discussion of terms beyond withdrawal, no framework for a prolonged engagement. He noted that the 30-day window was shorter than similar ultimatums from other species in comparable situations, and that shorter windows suggested higher confidence in compliance, which suggested that the issuer had not seriously planned for noncompliance. He flagged all of this in his initial assessment and submitted it to his commanding officer, Admiral Yori Peterson, who read it and looked at him with the expression of someone who had been thinking the same things and was pleased that someone else had also thought them. "What's your read?" Peterson asked. 14 victories. Reyes said. 0 defeats. They have never had to adapt their doctrine to a serious adaptive opponent. Their tactical flexibility, based on what we can observe from the 14 previous campaigns, is good within the range of situations they've encountered. We have no data on how it performs outside that range because nothing has pushed it outside that range. And we will. We're designed to, Reyes said. Not by choice, by history. We've been fighting wars for 10,000 years. They've been fighting them for 300. We have an institutional depth of experience with sustained conflict, with attrition, with fighting opponents who are locally superior, that they simply don't have because they've never needed it. Peterson looked at him for a moment. You think we can win? Reyes thought about this carefully, because he was the kind of analyst who thought about things carefully before stating them and did not state things he hadn't thought about carefully. I think we will not break under the initial assault the way every previous opponent has broken, he said. I think if we don't break in the first 3 months, we will be fighting a different war than the one they prepared for. And in that different war, our experience is an advantage and their lack of it is a vulnerability. He paused. I think we can win. I think it will take longer than anyone wants it to take and cost more than anyone wants it to cost. Peterson was quiet for a moment. The response, she said, one sentence, we will defend our space. Yes. That's everything we need to say. Reyes looked at the draft on the screen. It tells them what we're going to do without telling them how we're going to do it. It gives them no information about our strategy, our timeline, our concerns, our assessment of the situation. It is the minimum communication required to initiate the phase we're entering. He paused. And it uses the word defend, which is territorial language. We're telling them this is our space and we are defending it, which is different from telling them we reject their terms or we will fight. Defend implies duration. It implies we are prepared to continue defending for as long as defending is required. Peterson looked at the screen for a moment. Send it, she said. Month 1 arrived the way first months of wars always arrived, with a violence that was partly real and partly the violence of scale, of large forces in motion, of the specific shock of transition from a world where war was a possibility to a world where it was a fact. The Draken fleet crossed into human space in 3 coordinated columns, and the opening engagements were what the intelligence assessments had predicted. Draken forces locally superior. Human response contested withdrawal rather than fixed defense. The tactical picture moving in the Draken direction, but moving more slowly and more expensively than Vethkon's timeline required. This was deliberate. The human commanders had been given a single operational directive from Admiral Peterson's command. Do not give them a decisive engagement. Every contact with Draken forces was to be conducted on human terms. Engage where you choose. Withdraw when conditions shift. Make every meter of advance cost them something. But do not commit to the kind of fixed engagement that Draken doctrine was designed to win. The directive was simple, and it was extremely difficult to execute, because fixed engagement was the instinct of every military force, the gravitational pull of combat, and resisting it required the specific discipline of commanders who understood why they were doing something that felt wrong. The human commanders understood why. Vethkon did not understand why initially. The withdrawal confused him, not the fact of it, which was predictable, but the quality of it, which was not. Previous opponents had withdrawn in the way of forces that were retreating, which was the way of forces that were trying to put distance between themselves and what was behind them. The human withdrawal had a different quality. It was contested rather than clean, which meant they were fighting as they withdrew rather than withdrawing to fight later, which meant every Draken advance was an advance through contact rather than an advance through vacated space. The difference in resource consumption was significant and accumulating. He noted this in his operational logs at the end of month 1, which showed the hegemony in possession of 2 human colonial systems and the outer edge of a third, ahead of schedule on geographic objective, behind schedule on projected resource expenditure. He noted it and he filed it, and he considered it within the framework of 14 campaigns that had produced 14 victories. And the framework told him that opening resistance was expected, that it would decrease as the force of the Draken advance became clear, that the humans would break as every opponent had broken, and that the timeline would correct itself. The framework was wrong. Month 3 arrived, and the humans had not broken. They had not broken, and they had done something that Veth Khan's doctrine had no category for, which was make the occupation of taken systems more expensive than the taking had been. His garrisons in the two colonial systems were under pressure that was continuous but not conventional, not military assaults against Draken positions, which his forces were equipped and trained to repel, but something more diffuse and more difficult to address. Supply convoys were disrupted by methods that left no clear operational signature. Communication infrastructure degraded in ways that engineering teams repaired, and then found degraded again within days. Civilian cooperation, which Draken doctrine assumed as a baseline in occupied territory because previous occupied populations had provided it, was absent in ways that made the administrative function of occupation consume resources it wasn't budgeted to consume. The humans in the occupied systems were not fighting. They were simply not cooperating, which was different and harder to address because the tools Draken military doctrine provided for addressing an opponent who was fighting were sophisticated and proven, and the tools it provided for addressing an opponent who was simply not cooperating were almost non-existent. Veth Khan requested a briefing with Kaeldros at the end of month 3. The briefing lasted 2 hours, and it was the most honest conversation the general had conducted with the sovereign in 20 years of service, because honesty was what the situation required, and Veth Khan was, whatever his limitations, a being who prioritized the situation's requirements over the requirements of his own comfort. "The timeline is not holding," he said. Kaeldros looked at him. "The geographic objectives are met." "Yes, we hold the systems we declared we would hold. The cost of holding them is approximately twice the projected expenditure." Veth Khan placed the resource consumption analysis on the display between them. "They are making the occupation expensive without making it impossible, which is a distinction I have not previously encountered. Previous occupied populations accepted the terms of occupation. These populations are accepting the fact of occupation and refusing to accept its terms." Kaeldros looked at the analysis. "What do you need?" "I need them to break," Veth Khan said. "I have been waiting for 3 months for them to break and they have not broken. I need to understand why." There was a long pause. "Because they've been here before," Kaeldros said. He said it slowly, the way you said something you were understanding as you said it rather than something you had already understood. "They have historical experience with occupation, with resistance, with the specific practice of making occupation expensive without providing a conventional military target." Veth Khan looked at him. "Their history," Kaeldros said, "on their own planet before they reached space, they fought each other for thousands of years, occupation and resistance and occupation again. They have been on both sides of this specific situation many times." A pause. "They know how to do this." Veth Khan was quiet for a moment. He was a being who had spent 60 years mastering his craft, and he was encountering, with the specific discomfort of genuine mastery encountering its limits, the edge of what his craft covered. "I need additional forces," he said. Month 6 produced the Battle of Keth Station, which human historians would later describe as the turning point and Draken historians would later describe, in the more careful language of a civilization processing an unfamiliar experience, as the moment the strategic situation clarified. Keth Station was a logistics node at the junction of 3 transit corridors in the outer edge of the contested systems, not a strategically obvious target. Not the kind of position that conventional doctrine flagged as decisive, but the kind of position that 6 months of careful human strategic planning had identified as the specific point where the Draken operational architecture was most extended and most vulnerable. Admiral Peterson had been building toward this engagement for 6 months. The building had not looked like building. It had looked like the contested withdrawal of month 1 and the occupation harassment of months 2 and 3, and the careful, grinding operational activity of months 4 and 5, none of which individually appeared decisive and all of which had been, collectively, shaping the Draken position, extending their supply lines, degrading their logistics capacity, pulling their operational reserve into the occupation management problem, drawing their attention to the wrong places so that when the right place appeared, the forces that should have been positioned to defend it were positioned somewhere else. The battle lasted 4 days. Reyes watched it from the intelligence center with the specific quality of attention of someone who has been predicting an outcome for 6 months and is now watching to see if the prediction was accurate. It was accurate. The Draken forces at Keth Station were degraded, extended, and operating at the end of supply lines that 6 months of harassment had made unreliable. And when the human fleet committed to the engagement, it committed to an opponent that was not the opponent it would have faced in month 1. The Draken lost 31 ships. Human losses were significant: 19 vessels, crews gone, a cost that was real and would remain real, but sustainable, absorbed by a force that had been structured for a sustained campaign rather than a decisive engagement. Veth Khan, reviewing the Keth Station after action in his command suite aboard the Draken flagship, did something that Reyes would later describe in his operational assessment as the most significant indicator of Draken military quality, which was that he understood immediately what had happened and did not require additional evidence to confirm it. He requested additional forces from the Sovereign. The request was 40 additional vessels. Kaeldros authorized it without hesitation because he trusted Veth Khan's judgment, and because the alternative to authorization was conceding what had been declared concluded, and that was not a category of action that existed in his framework. The 40 vessels arrived 3 months later. They arrived into a war that had changed. The human command had used the 3 months since Keth Station the way they had used every period of the campaign, deliberately, without waste, doing the specific things that the next phase required. They had consolidated their logistics position. They had rebuilt their damaged vessels where possible and absorbed the losses where not. They had continued the occupation harassment with the persistent, unglamorous dedication of people doing necessary work. And they had done one additional thing that the arriving Draken reinforcements would not immediately understand, and would understand too late. They had learned the Draken fleet. 11 months of fighting produced a specific kind of knowledge that no intelligence assessment could replicate, which was the operational knowledge of an opponent's actual behavior under actual conditions. The patterns that emerged under pressure, the tendencies that appeared when doctrine was stressed, the specific ways in which Draken commanders made decisions when the situation was developing faster than their frameworks could process it. The human commanders who had been fighting for 9 months were not fighting the same opponent the intelligence files described. They were fighting the opponent that 9 months of contact had revealed, which was more specific and more accurate, and in some ways more exploitable than anything the files contained. The reinforcements were excellent ships commanded by skilled officers following sound doctrine. They were fighting into a situation that had been shaped for 9 months to be exactly what the human force was prepared for, and exactly what the Draken reinforcements were not. The deterioration of the Draken position in months 9 through 11 was methodical in the specific way of processes that are not dramatic and are nonetheless inexorable. Not a dramatic reversal, no single battle of Keth Station scale, no moment of sudden collapse. Just the slow, grinding reality of a force operating in a strategic environment that had been carefully shaped against it, losing small amounts consistently, each loss contributing to the conditions that produced the next loss. The operational architecture of the hegemony's position in human space, degrading in the way that structures degraded when the things supporting them were removed one by one. Vethkan saw it happening. This was, in its own way, the most significant thing about him, that he was good enough at his work to understand what was occurring while it was occurring, to see the shape of it clearly rather than through the distorting lens of what he had expected. He had expected the reinforcements to change the trajectory. They had not changed it. They had slowed it. And slowing a deterioration and stopping a deterioration were different things, and the difference was now visible in his operational data, and he had looked at the data clearly, and he had reached the conclusion that the data required. He requested an audience with Sovereign Kaeldros. He had never, in 60 years of military service, made this particular kind of request. The category of request did not exist in the Draken military tradition in the form he needed to make it, so he made it in the only language available, which was the formal request for strategic consultation with the sovereign, which had previously been used for decisions about initiating operations rather than concluding them. Kaeldros granted the audience immediately. They met in the sovereign's working office, not the formal council chamber, which was a choice Kaeldros made deliberately because formal chambers imposed a formality that made honest conversation more expensive, and he suspected this conversation was going to require honesty in a form that formality would impede. Vethkan arrived, and he stood before the sovereign with the bearing of 60 years of military service and the specific quality of a being who has reached a conclusion he does not like, and has decided that liking it is not the relevant consideration. He said we should seek terms. The office was very quiet. Kaeldros looked at his general for a long moment. "Explain your assessment," he said. Vethkan explained. He was thorough and precise and completely honest, which cost him something that did not show in his face and was visible only in the slight additional deliberateness of his already deliberate posture. He described the operational position, the resource consumption figures, the strategic situation as it stood, and as it projected forward across the next 3 months. He described what he expected would happen if operations continued, not defeat in a dramatic sense, but the continuation of the trajectory, more losses, more cost, a position that was already untenable becoming more so. "And if we commit additional forces," Kaeldros asked. "We do not have additional forces of sufficient scale to change the trajectory," Vethkan said. "We have reserves. Deploying reserves extends the timeline. It does not change the outcome." He paused. "The humans are fighting a kind of war our doctrine was not built to address. We have been adapting. We have not adapted fast enough or sufficiently. They have been learning this specific conflict for 11 months, and they have learned it better than we have." Kaeldros was quiet for a long time. He was a being who had managed significant responsibilities for 22 years, which had given him the specific capacity to sit with difficult information and allow it to be what it was before deciding what to do with it. He sat with this information now, and he allowed it to be what it was, which was information that required him to do something that had no precedent in Draken history, which was seek terms with an opponent who had defeated him. "What terms do you expect they will offer?" he asked. "Unknown," Vethkan said. "We have no model for how humans behave in this position. They have not occupied this position before in our experience." Kaeldros nodded slowly. "Convene the council. I will speak with them before we transmit." The council was not unanimous. The council was rarely unanimous on anything, but on this specific question the division was sharper and more emotional than councils typically permitted themselves to be, because the question was not a policy question with policy stakes. It was a question about what the hegemony was, which was the kind of question that produced responses the council's procedural norms were not designed to manage. 4 of the 12 council members argued for continuing, not because they believed the military assessment was wrong, Vethcon's reputation was too solid for that argument to hold. But because the alternative was a thing, they did not have words for in Draken political vocabulary, and the absence of words made it difficult to accept as real. 3 argued for terms on explicitly pragmatic grounds: the resource cost, the strategic position, the calculation of what continued operations would extract versus what terms might produce. The remaining 5 said little, which was the Council's traditional response to situations for which it had no established position. Kaeldros listened to all of it and said, "We will seek terms." The human terms arrived 6 hours later. The Council received this fact in silence, because 6 hours was not enough time for a diplomatic transmission to have been drafted in response to an approach that had not yet been formally made. And the only explanation for 6 hours was that the terms had been drafted before the approach, which meant the humans had anticipated the approach, which meant they had known the hegemony would be seeking terms before the hegemony had formally decided to seek them. The council chamber was very quiet while the terms were read. They were not what had been expected. The expected form was what the hegemony's own treaties looked like: territorial definitions, resource claims, political concessions, the material extraction of advantage from a concluded conflict. The human terms had some of this: withdrawal from the occupied systems, reparations for civilian infrastructure damaged in the campaign, specific amounts and specific timelines. These were understandable. These fit a framework the council could process. The final condition did not. Sovereign Kaeldros will make a personal visit to the capital city of Draken Prime, accompanied by a human military officer designated by the Compact's military command. The visit will include inspection of areas affected by military operations conducted during the conflict. The visit will be recorded in full, and the recording will be made available to the Draken public within 30 days of the treaty's signing. The council erupted. Humiliation, theater, political destruction dressed as a treaty condition, an attempt to delegitimize the sovereign's authority through public exposure of what they were already calling the defeat, the word appearing in the chamber for the first time, the word that hadn't existed in Draken political vocabulary 2 hours ago and was now being used freely, with the specific energy of a word finally available after being needed for some time. Kaeldros raised a hand. The chamber quieted. "Leave me," he said. They left, some of them slowly, some of them quickly, all of them looking at him with the expressions of beings who wanted to say something and were processing whether this was the moment. It was not the moment. They left. He sat alone in the council chamber for a long time. He read the condition again. He read the full terms again, all of them beginning to end, with the careful attention he brought to primary documents. He thought about the humans, what he knew of them, which was more than he had known 11 months ago, and still, he was beginning to understand, considerably less than he needed. He thought about the specific quality of the condition, the way it was structured, not a demand for tribute, not a territorial concession, not the forms of advantage that winning powers extracted from losing ones in the Draken tradition. A walk through the capital with a witness, recorded for the public. He thought about what you did when you wanted someone to understand something. You showed them. You did not describe it or argue it or demand they acknowledge it. You showed them the specific thing you needed them to see, in the specific place where it was most clearly visible, and you let them look. He thought about the condition for a long time. Then he accepted it. Colonel Sarah Ockhaffer arrived on Draken Prime on a gray morning, 3 days after the treaty was signed. She had been selected for this assignment by Admiral Peterson, who had given her the briefing in 3 sentences. You will accompany Sovereign Kaeldros on a walk through the capital's affected areas. The walk will be recorded. Your job is to show him what needs to be shown and to do it as a soldier, which means without theater and without anger and with complete accuracy. Peterson had looked at her for a moment after the 3 sentences and then said, "I chose you because you've been in the occupied systems. You've been in those communities. You know what it actually looks like and you know how to talk about it without performing it. Go do that. HFY had spent 2 of the 11 months of the war in the human colonial systems under Draken occupation, embedded with the resistance infrastructure, not fighting, observing, assessing, reporting. She had been in the communities while the Draken garrisons were there. She had spoken to the people who had lived under it. She knew what to show him. She arrived at the Draken capital aboard a compact military transport that was met by a full protocol detail, which she acknowledged and then moved past with the brisk efficiency of someone who understood ceremony and was not going to let it consume time that belonged to the work. She was wearing her operational uniform, not dress uniform, not the formal configuration that diplomatic occasions invited, but the plain working uniform of a field officer with the insignia of her rank and nothing else. No ribbons, no decorations, the minimum required identification of who she was and what she represented. The Draken protocol officer looked at the uniform and did not say anything, which was, HFY thought, the correct response. She was taken to the council chamber. Dross was already there when she entered. She had seen images. The intelligence files contained photographs and video from public Draken broadcasts, the Sovereign at formal events, the Sovereign at military reviews, the Sovereign at the various occasions at which a sovereign of a militaristic civilization appeared publicly. The images had given her accurate information about what he looked like and no information about what he was like, which was the gap that images reliably produced. He was large, as the Draken were large standing. He was perhaps half a meter taller than she was, with the dense, heavy build of a species that had developed in high-gravity environments, his skin the dark gray-green of Draken males in middle age. He was standing when she entered, which was a choice. He could have been seated. The chamber had a configuration that would have given him elevated position above an arriving guest, and he had not used it. He was standing in the center of the room, which put them at the same spatial level, which was also a choice. She filed both choices as information. She crossed the room and stopped at a distance that was close enough for direct conversation, and not close enough to require either of them to manage the proximity. Sovereign Dross, she said. Colonel HFY, he said. His translator rendered the exchange cleanly. His voice had the quality she had noticed in Draken communication generally, direct, without the social modulation that human voices applied to speech, the rises and falls that signaled deference or confidence or warmth. Simply the words at a volume that assumed they would be heard. They looked at each other for a moment. "Are you ready?" she asked. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, not resistance, not acceptance, something in between. "I have agreed to this," he said. "That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "I don't believe I am." She nodded once. "That's honest." She looked at the door. "We'll go anyway." They walked. The capital city of Draken Prime was not destroyed. This was important to establish clearly, because the record was going to be public, and the record needed to be accurate rather than dramatic. And accuracy and drama were not always the same thing. The human strikes in the final phase of the war had been targeted: military command nodes, logistics infrastructure, communication systems, the specific physical architecture of the military occupation's operational capacity. The targeting had been precise by the standards of military precision, which were not the standards of surgical precision, which was a distinction that mattered. The city bore the marks of what had happened. They walked through the district nearest the Central Command Complex first, because that was where the most visible effect was. And starting with the most visible was accurate. The Central Complex itself was largely intact. The human strikes had targeted its communications infrastructure and its power distribution rather than the structure, because the structure was not the operational target. but the district surrounding it had been in the secondary effect zone of several strikes, and the secondary effects were visible. A residential building on the eastern edge of the district had lost its upper 3 floors. The floors had not collapsed. The structural damage was contained to the upper section, the consequence of a pressure wave from a strike on an adjacent military logistics facility. The lower 6 floors were intact and occupied. The upper 3 were gone. HFY stopped in front of it. She did not say anything immediately. She let him look at it. She let the looking be what it was for a moment before she spoke. This building had 42 residential units, she said. On the night of the strike, 31 of them were occupied. The upper 3 floors had 11 units. 7 of them were occupied. She paused. 14 people. Kale Dross looked at the building. He was very still. The strike that caused this, HFY continued, was targeted at the logistics facility 200 meters to the northeast. The facility was a valid military target. It was managing supply distribution for your occupation forces in 2 of the colonial systems. The strike was accurate. The secondary pressure wave was within the modeled parameters for that type of munition in that configuration. She paused. 14 people. She let the number sit. Then she said, "We are going to walk for 4 hours. I am going to show you specific things. I am going to tell you what happened at each one. I am not going to tell you whose fault it was. You are a person who started a war and I am a person who fought in it, and neither of us is in a position to be objective about whose fault it was, and I don't think that conversation is the one that needs to happen today." He looked at her. "The conversation that needs to happen today," she said, "is this one. The one where you see the specific place where the decisions arrived." They walked. The market square was 20 minutes from the residential district, a wide paved space in the commercial center of the city, surrounded by the kind of low buildings that markets accumulated around, the infrastructure of daily commerce. There was a crater in the northeast corner of the square, filled now and repaved, but visible. The new paving material was slightly different in color from the old, the way repairs were always visible if you knew to look. The square had not been struck. The crater was from a piece of a munition casing that had fragmented after detonation at a targeting site 3 blocks away. The fragment was not guided and not targeted. It was the consequence of physics, of energy released at one point and distributed in multiple directions, some of them into things that were not the target. HFY took out a physical folder. Inside it were photographs. She had decided against a digital display because a physical folder was harder to dismiss, required more direct engagement, was in the hand rather than on a screen. She showed him 2 photographs. The first was the square before, taken from a public feed 3 months before the war's final phase, showing the market in operation, stalls and people, and the ordinary commerce of an ordinary morning. The second was the square after, taken the day after the strike, showing the crater, the displaced paving, the stalls that had been closest to the impact point. She let him look at both. Then she said the names. Ruthlessly, she was 81 years old. She had maintained a fabric stall in this market for 40 years. Her stall was in the northeast corner, HFY pointed. Here, she was there when the fragment landed. She died at the site. She paused. Drath Ven, 63. He was the market's administrative coordinator, responsible for stall assignments and dispute resolution. He was crossing the square when the fragment landed. He died 3 hours later at the medical facility. Another pause. Yeva Kas, 22. She was a student. She was cutting through the square on her way to the transit station. She was not a regular market visitor. She happened to be there. HFY looked at the square. She died at the site. Kale Dross stood in the market square and looked at the photographs, and listened to the names, and did not say anything. HFY put the photographs back in the folder. "The fragment was not targeted at this square," she said. The weapons operator who fired the munition that produced that fragment was targeting a communication node 3 blocks away. The targeting was accurate. The fragmentation pattern was within expected parameters. None of these people were intended to be harmed. She looked at the repaved section. They were harmed anyway, she said. That is the specific nature of the information I am giving you today. Not that your war was wrong, I am a soldier. I am not going to stand in a public square and tell a head of state that his political decisions were wrong, because that is not my role and not my expertise. I am giving you information. Specific, accurate information about the specific place where the decisions arrived. Kale Dross looked at the repaved section. He looked at it for a long time. Their names, he said, not a question. Rithiasol Drathvin Yevakas. He looked at the square for a long moment more. Then he turned and they continued walking. The hospital was the last stop. It had not been struck. It was not near any strike site. It was in a district that had not been operationally significant and had not received any direct attention from either side. From the outside, it looked entirely intact, which it was. They stood in front of it and Akafar said, "The power grid that serves this facility runs through a distribution node that was struck in the operation's second week. The node was a valid target. It was supplying power to 3 command facilities. The strike was accurate. The hospital's grid was affected because the distribution architecture routed through the same node. The hospital lost primary power for 11 days. She looked at the building. This facility has 340 beds. During the 11-day power interruption, it was operating on emergency backup systems. Backup systems support life-critical equipment. They do not support the full operational capacity of the facility. She paused. In 11 days, 46 patients required procedures or interventions that could not be performed at backup capacity. 12 of them did not survive the delay. She let that sit. 12 people, she said, who were in a hospital that was not struck, in a district that was not targeted, in a city that was not the primary theater of the war. They died because a distribution node 3 kilometers from this facility was a valid military target and was accurately struck, and the secondary effect on this facility's power grid was within the modeled parameters, and 12 people in this building were in the wrong phase of their medical situations during the 11 days that followed. The morning light was coming through the clouds now, gray-white and even, the kind of light that showed things clearly without drama. Kale Dross stood in front of the hospital for a long time. He was thinking, Akafar observed, with the specific quality of a being who was thinking about something genuinely difficult, not resistant to it, not processing it through a framework that would make it manageable, but actually sitting with the difficulty of it, letting it be as difficult as it was. She thought, he is going to be worth talking to. They walked to the small square near the hospital. It was a quiet space, trees, benches, a fountain that was running, the kind of space a city makes near its medical facilities for the people who needed somewhere to be while they waited for news. A memorial had been placed there recent, the stone still sharp-edged with newness. Names carved into it, not all the names, more names than she had given him today, the full accounting of what the war had cost this city. She stood in front of the memorial and she said, "Why did you start this war?" He was quiet for a long moment. "We assessed that your expansion vector would intersect with Draken's strategic interests in approximately 30 years, he said. We determined that it was more efficient to establish dominance now, while you were still a developing power, than to address the intersection when you were more established." She looked at him. "Efficient," she said. The word sat in the air between them. "Yes," he said. And then, after a moment, the way a being said something it was understanding for the first time as it said it. "That is what I said." "We would have negotiated," she said. "We have negotiated with every species we have encountered in space. Everyone. We have never initiated a conflict. We have fought several. Every conflict we have fought was initiated by the other party." She paused. We would have sat down with your representatives and worked out a framework for the intersection you were concerned about. We do that. It is what we do first, before anything else, because we have been at war enough times to understand what it costs and to prefer the alternative when the alternative is available. He looked at the memorial. I understand, he said slowly, that this walk was not punishment. She looked at him. It was information, he said. You wanted me to have information I did not have when I made the decision. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. He looked at the names on the memorial. He looked at them the way he had looked at the photographs in the market square and the hospital and the residential building, with the complete attention of a being who had decided to look at something fully rather than partially. I had comprehensive intelligence on your military capability, he said. I had detailed assessments of your colonial infrastructure and your political structure. I had projections of your expansion timeline. He paused. I had no intelligence on this. She said nothing. This was not in any file, he said. The files described your military, your technology, your political divisions, your capacity for sustained conflict. He looked at the square, the fountain, the memorial with its sharp-edged new stone. The files did not describe what the decisions looked like when they arrived. Most people don't have that information, HFY said, until they do. They stood in the square for a while in the gray morning light, a Draken sovereign and a human colonel, in the quiet space near a hospital, in front of a memorial with names on it. She thought about Peterson's 3 sentences. Show him what needs to be shown. Do it as a soldier, without theater and without anger and with complete accuracy. She had done that. She thought about the people whose names she had said today. Rithiasol, Drathvin, Yevakos, and the 12 in the hospital, and the 14 in the residential district, and the others whose names she hadn't said today because there were more of them than 4 hours could contain. She thought about them not as a total, not as a statistic, but as the specific people they had been, which was how she had been thinking about them since the 2 months she had spent in the occupied systems, talking to communities that were counting their losses the way communities counted losses. By name, by face, by the specific absence that each person left. She thought about why humans still did this after 10,000 years of it. The counting by name, the memorials, the records, the specific refusal to let the numbers remain numbers. She had thought about it many times and the answer was always the same, which was that numbers didn't remember themselves and someone had to do the remembering, and the ones who were left were the ones who could. We should return, she said. He looked at her, yes. They walked back through the city in the gray morning light, the sovereign of the Draken hegemony and a human colonel, through streets that were going about their ordinary business, people on their way to work, the early commerce of a city's morning, the vast, complicated, ordinary life of a civilization that had been through something and was continuing. Nobody on the streets acknowledged them. The recording crew was ahead and behind, unobtrusive, the presence of cameras, a fact of the walk that the city had absorbed without drama. They reached the council chamber. At the door, HFY stopped. The treaty will hold, she said, not as reassurance, as information. Not because we have the capacity to enforce it, though we do, because you understood what the walk was for. Those are different reasons and the second one is more durable. Dross looked at her. How do you know I understood it? Because you told me what it was, she said. I didn't tell you, you named it yourself. Information you didn't have when you made the decision. That's understanding. She looked at him steadily. Most people need to be told. She extended her hand. He looked at it for a moment, the human gesture, the contact convention, the small ritual of conclusion. Then he took it, carefully, the way a being took something it had been briefed on and was performing correctly for the first time. Colonel HFY, he said. Sovereign Dross, she said. She left. The council reconvened at midday. Kaeldros sat at the head of the table and looked at the 12 faces looking back at him, and what he saw in those faces was what he had expected to see. The assessment, the calibration, the waiting to understand what this morning had produced in him and what it was going to mean for them. He spoke for 40 minutes. He told them he intended to honor the treaty fully. The withdrawal from the occupied systems would begin immediately and be complete within the specified timeline. The reparations would be paid as specified, on the specified schedule, without negotiation for reduction or extension, because the amounts were what they were, and what they were was accurate. He told them he was initiating a review of Draken military doctrine, to be led by Veth Khan, to be completed within 1 year, and that the review would include as a required element a comprehensive study of the experience of the populations in the occupied systems during the Draken occupation, compiled from the accounts of those populations directly. The council was silent for a moment. Then several things happened simultaneously, objections forming, political calculations running, the council doing what councils did when they received information that required them to revise their positions. One general said, "This is capitulation." Kaeldros looked at him. "This is information," he said. "We made a decision without adequate information. We were operating on a framework that had not been tested against this specific situation and was therefore not reliable for this specific situation. We will not make that error again." "The review of doctrine is necessary," Kaeldros said. "We have 14 victories and one outcome that the doctrine did not predict. Any framework that produces one outcome its model did not predict requires examination. This is not a political position. It is analytical practice." The general was quiet. A council member near the end of the table, Councillor Jethvan, who had been silent through most of the session, said carefully, "The human officer, the colonel, what was she like?" The chamber was quiet. Kaeldros thought about 4 hours. He thought about the Market Square photographs, held in the hand rather than displayed on a screen. He thought about the names said in the order they were said, not as a list, but one at a time, with space between them. He thought about the hospital and the 11 days, and the precision with which she had described the cause and the effect without assigning blame, because assigning blame was not what the moment required. He thought about the small square near the hospital and the memorial and the question, "Why did you start this war?" asked in the voice of someone who genuinely wanted to know the answer, who was not asking rhetorically, who would listen to what he said and process it as information. He thought about her last words to him at the door of this chamber. "Most people need to be told." She was exactly what you would expect, he said, from a species that has been fighting wars for 10,000 years and is still here. She knew precisely what she was doing and she did only what was necessary, nothing more and nothing less. He paused. She was not angry. I had expected anger. There was none. There was only accuracy, complete, patient, specific accuracy. She showed me what she needed me to see, and she told me what she needed me to know, and she did it without any additional weight on it. Jethvan nodded slowly. "And the condition," the counselor said, "the walk, you accepted it." "Yes." "Why?" Kaeldros looked at the council table. He thought about the moment alone in this chamber, reading the condition, thinking about what you did when you needed someone to understand something. He thought about the walk and what it had been, which was exactly what he had understood it to be before he took it, and different in every specific detail from what understanding it abstractly had prepared him for. "Because it was the right condition," he said. "It was the condition that contained the information the situation required me to have. Declining it would have been declining the information, which would have been refusing to understand what had happened." He looked around the table. "We made a decision with incomplete information, and the decision produced an outcome we did not intend and did not predict. The appropriate response to that sequence is not to defend the decision or to reframe the outcome. The appropriate response is to obtain the missing information and revise accordingly." He paused. She gave me the information. I have revised accordingly. The council was very quiet. Dross looked at the battle standards on the wall. 14 of them. 14 campaigns, 14 victories, 300 years of the pattern holding. He looked at them for a moment, these 14 standards that had defined what the hegemony was and what it expected of itself, and what it understood about the galaxy it operated in. Initiate contact with the Compact's diplomatic office, he said. I want to begin formal diplomatic normalization discussions within 60 days, not because the treaty requires it, because it is the appropriate next step. The council looked at him. And the doctrine review, he said, will include a module on what the intelligence files do not capture, on the specific information that assessments of military capability and political structure do not contain, on what it looks like when the decisions arrive. He looked at Jeth Vaughn. We will not begin another war without that module in every commander's preparation. Jeth Vaughn nodded. The session ended. Akafer was 3 hours into the return transit when she opened her report terminal. She wrote with the efficiency of a field officer, accustomed to producing documentation in conditions that were not ideal, which was to say she wrote clearly and specifically, and without wasted words, in the format that military reports required, covering the operational requirements of the assignment systematically. She wrote about the walk, the locations, the specific information conveyed at each, the sovereign's observable responses, the condition of the affected areas, the accuracy of the documentation she had compiled. She wrote about the treaty signing and her assessment of its durability. She wrote about the Draken Protocol and her interactions with the official detail and the specific logistical elements of the operation. She reached the additional observations section. She sat for a moment. Then she wrote, Sovereign Dross is an intelligent being who made a decision with incomplete information and is capable of updating his understanding when the information changes. This is not common. In my assessment, the treaty will hold, not because we have the capability to enforce it, though we do, but because he understood what the walk was for, and he is the kind of being who acts on understanding. I recommend diplomatic normalization be initiated at the earliest opportunity. The Draken hegemony has never lost a war before. What they do with the experience of losing one will define what they become. Based on what I observed today, my assessment is that it will not make them smaller. She looked at what she had written. She added one sentence. He named the names after I said them, at the market square. Quietly to himself after I had moved on, I heard it. I did not acknowledge it. It was not for me. She submitted the report and closed the terminal. Outside the transport viewport, the transit corridor showed the specific visual quality of faster-than-light travel. Not stars, not darkness. The in-between that had no adequate description, and that she had stopped trying to describe after enough hours in transit corridors to have exhausted the available language. She thought about the walk. She thought about Rithiasol, who had had a fabric stall for 40 years, and Drathven, who had resolved market disputes, and Yevakas, who had been cutting through on her way to the transit station and had happened to be there. She thought about the 12 in the hospital and the 14 in the residential building, and the names on the memorial with its new sharp-edged stone. She thought about Dross standing in the market square, looking at the photographs, saying nothing for a long time. She thought about 11 months of war, and what 11 months cost in the specific currency that wars extracted, and about the fact that the currency was real even when the cause was unjust, and the outcome was correct, and that the two things were both true and did not cancel each other out. She thought, you showed him what needed to be shown. You did it as a soldier. You did not perform it, and you were not angry, and you were accurate. She thought, that is the work, and you did it. Outside the viewport, the transit corridor moved past in its undescribable way, carrying her through the space between 2 points, through the dark between the specific place she had been and the specific place she was going, which was home, which was the space that had been fought for and held, which was the space that looked different now than it had 11 months ago, which was the way everything looked after you had paid the real price of it. She leaned her head back in the transit seat. She slept,